Alright, with all the craziness going on with COVID-19 and everything here, this really kind of brings out the importance of that we all need to kind of stick together as a community. In our area where we live, everybody in the valley that we live in, we all really try to watch out for each other, help each other out, which is going to bring us to today's project, which is this huge F-350 that barely fits in my shop. My neighbor boy's teenage boy lives across the street. He has this. It's a 2006 F-350 diesel. The problem he's having is the transmission went out on it. Now, I'm not an ASE certified mechanic by any means. I worked on cars for many years. I work at a power plant now, so I'm pretty mechanically inclined. So to help him out right now, I told him I'd go ahead and I'd put a transmission in this truck. He doesn't have a lot of money to put a good rebuilt or anything like that in it, so he went by the junkyard, picked one up, and I told him I'll do what I could for him. So let's go ahead and get underneath this thing and start getting this transmission out. Alright, so here we are under the truck. One of the first things we're going to get going here. First thing is drain the transmission. So I already drained all the fluid. Eventually we'll get up to the cooler and everything, but I want to focus on the main part of the transmission right now. I got the first 2 bolts out of the drive shaft already removed. It's a 12 millimeter. To get to the other 2, what I ended up doing was just putting the truck in neutral, jacking up the rear end, rotating this drive shaft 180 degrees. Now I can get these lower 2 bolts out, and then we're going to put this drive shaft out of the way, and then we're going to start focusing on getting this transfer case off and out of the way, and then we'll get to the transmission. Before I get too far ahead of myself, one thing I do like to do is actually mark this drive shaft so I know where it was at, so it goes back in the same position. I don't think it matters because the drive shaft's balanced, but it's just something I like to do just for my own peace of mind, make sure it goes back in the exact way it came out. Alright, one thing I like to do as I'm going through here is I always try to keep the old bolts actually threaded in where they are so that I never lose anything. I'm not left over with a pile of bolts figuring out where everything goes. So I just put everything by hand here. The other thing that I didn't have earlier that I recommend is anytime you're under a truck is get on some glasses. I already have some stuff following my eyes and that doesn't make for a fun day. So now we're going to drop this skid bolt, or skid plate, and it's got a 10 millimeter socket. So let's get this thing off and out of our way. Alright, we got the skid plate out of the way. Now we're going to get this front drive shaft out of our way. It's a 12 millimeter. Pretty much what I'm going to do with this, just so I can make sure I get this thing out of here, because these bolts are pretty tight, is to just take a pry bar, put that in with the U-joints, rest that up against the switch, right against this aluminum housing. That way, as I pull down on this wrench here, locks that U-joint in place. And then get a little bit of leverage on it. So you can see a little better here about what I was talking about. Wedge this in between these U-joints, and that wedges it right against this aluminum housing here. So it gives you a better chance to actually get some leverage if you got these get these bolts loose here. Okay, so we got the front drive shaft out. So now we've got 3 sensors we have to hook. One that's up here on top of the transfer case, one down here, and one right there on the side. So we'll get those off, and then we go ahead and pull the transfer case. Alright, so to remove the transfer case, we got a 13 mil. It's 5 or 6 bolts, I can't remember, that run up along here. So you got one bolt here, is the first one, and they kind of go all the way around. I believe there's one up high on this side, and then the other side's actually got a dowel rod on it. So we'll get all those removed all the way around the case here, and then we should be able to actually drop the transfer case at that point, and then we'll start getting into the transmission. Alright, so we got the transfer case out. One thing I will have to say pulling this transfer case is I think when I go back in, I'm going to try to have the transmission and transfer case already bolted. It's going to be a heck of a lot harder because there's a lot more metal to move around, but these bolts, especially this lower one and these two top bolts, because there's just not a whole lot of room to get in there, you got to have a ratcheting 13mm wrench to get them out, and it's itty bitty movements at a time, and it took me forever to get those out. So definitely get a 13mm. If you have to pull it out like this, if you don't have a jack or however you're doing it on the ground, 13mm ratcheting wrench is a must. Alright, so let's go ahead and I'm going to get the cooler lines, everything else taken off of this transmission, and hopefully have this transmission on the ground here in the next couple hours. Alright, so we got the cooler lines unhooked. So now we're going to get the dipstick tube removed, which is right here. I believe there's just an O-ring inside here that we can just get that yank to pop that up. If I remember right, I think it's actually easier to pull the dipstick out of it first and then just kind of give it a good yank here. And then we've got a couple of different sensors. We've got one sensor here on the base of the transmission. We got some other wiring harnesses that come up over the top. And then from this side of the transmission up here, there's one sensor on the very top up here. And then we're going to have to undo all of the linkage coming back from the selector switch, get this all undone, and then we'll go ahead and we'll start pulling the casing bolts, but we want to get all the electrical, everything off of it, so that way as I drop this casing, the whole thing's going to come out. I did disconnect the battery. Anytime I'm messing with a lot of wiring harnesses, probably is a good idea. Anytime you're doing that kind of stuff, just disconnect it just in case. So let's continue on getting the rest of this thing unhooked and try to get this transmission on the ground here before we call it a day. Alright, so here's the transmission tube, and if you follow it down just below the valve cover gasket down here, there's a 10mm. You need a 10mm deep socket to pull that one off. Once you get that bolt off, that dipstick will just pop right out. There's just a little O-ring on the bottom of it. I'm going to go ahead and probably go to the dealership, get a new O-ring for it, just since I have this thing apart, just to make sure everything's all fixed. Let's get this pulled out, and then we'll go back underneath there and show you all the wiring harnesses. Okay, so here's the transmission dipstick tube line here. We just got the 10mm up top off of it, so now it just pops right out, just like that. So now we can kind of push that up out of the way. So now we got the dipstick tube is out, cooler lines are unhooked, and then if we come back here, there was one large switch, which was right up in here. Can't really see it now because I don't have good light. There's a switch in here that takes a 10mm socket. Once you undo that 10mm, you can undo the plug and pull it down out of the way. So then what I did here is I took the wiring harness, drug it completely out of my way here so I don't have to worry about hitting it as I pull the transmission out. So the next bolts we're going to start doing is we're going to start hitting all the bolts around the bell housing and then start loosening this thing up, see if we can get her out. Alright, so transmission's completely unbolted. All the wiring harness, everything are removed. So the only bolts we have left are on the flex plate here into the torque converter. Ford, being the geniuses that they are, the little tiny port that they give you to actually remove these bolts is just far enough in that a deep socket is too big and you can't hit the oil pan, and a short socket is short enough that you can't get a good bite on the bolt. So I ended up having to do a 1/4 inch to 3/8 to the 14, which gave me just enough to get everything to fit in there. So we're going to remove all these bolts inside here. I've got one of them off, and let's come up to the front of the motor and show you how I'm rotating this to pull these bolts out. Alright, so if you look up on here, I've got a wrench up there on the harmonic balancer. So to crank this, all I have to do is grab that wrench, just take a little bit of leverage, and then rotate the motor so that I can get to each one of those bolts back there on the flex plate. So it is an 18mm wrench, And I just grabbed my real long one so it gets up in there, so I have a little bit more to get more leverage on it. So now we can pull the rest of those bolts off, and then we can slide this transmission back and get it out. Alright, the other thing is make sure you got a magnet handy, because I just had my little extension drop down in there. So make sure you got a little magnet, because this is not exactly an easy spot to get to. Alright, transmission's on the ground. So we took all the switches and all the sensors, everything that was on this one, and we're going to put that onto the other transmission. Now the other transmission is a junkyard trans, so everything is on it, pretty much all the wiring harness, everything were just cut off. So hopefully all the sensors are good, but we're going to put those on the other transmission. The harness that actually mounts for the switch selector is different, so I'm going to change out that bracket, make sure it matches. I'm sure hoping that's about the only other things that are wrong with it. The sensors, everything look pretty close to each other, have the same number of wires. I guess we're really going to see once I start getting it up in there how things work. But right now we're going to go ahead and we're going to head over here and show you we're going to replace the filter. And while we have the filter off, we're going to go ahead and we're going to flush through the cooler lines, get everything flushed out before we start stuffing the other transmission in here. Alright, so here's the external filter. The cooler lines are coming. This is right here, right directly under the front bumper, right here attached to the frame. So we're going to go ahead and take this off. We're going to drain this out, and while this is open, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run some transmission cooler flush from the transmission lines to the filter housing, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to install this housing again while it's empty, and then I'm going to flush some more through the rest of the cooler lines right here at the bottom of the transmission to make sure I'm flushing everything to the cooler and from the cooler back to the transmission. Again, this is a junkyard transmission, so it is what it is. But, you know, that's kind of where we're at. Let's get everything flushed the best we can. Now this is why anytime you're doing a transmission, rebuild, replace anything, even if you're going to put a new transmission in, why you always replace your filters. I don't know how well it's going to show up on the video, but as I dropped it in there, those are all metal shavings. This is after I've already flushed the lines out once, so I haven't replaced a new filter yet. And then when I open this up, look down at all those nice little metal shavings down inside there. So that is why anytime you're doing a transmission, make sure you flush it, get all new fluid, put more new filters, because all that going into a brand new transmission would be bad news. Alright, so here we are getting ready to put the transmission in. So we got the other one guiding up here, and I'm getting close enough that I wanted to go ahead and drop a couple of bolts in here, just so I have kind of a guide to see how close I am to getting this line back up. The hardest part about putting this transmission is going to be lining the flex plate back up through that little tiny access port right there. I have the bolts pretty close to the torque converter where I think it looks like they're going to go straight in, but it's going to be one of those I'm not going to know until I start getting a little bit closer. So hopefully it goes quick. What I ended up also doing here, since I have this thing going, is I went ahead and reinstalled the skid plate. I didn't cinch any of the bolts down. All the bolts are just hand tight up here on the side and on the other side as well. So now that I know if this transmission needs to drop, I at least have a stop back here, so it's never going to go too low, and now I never have to worry about the transmission sliding either way. You probably saw when I was pulling this out, all I had was just a typical floor jack. So today I ended up going to getting an ATV jack, which I actually found the motorcycle jack worked a lot better, gave me a lot larger surface working area. Plus, trying to do this within a budget here for the customer, it was a lot cheaper to buy this lift than it was to go get an actual transmission jack. Transmission jacks are not cheap. So this is just a motorcycle jack, and it worked perfectly to get that transmission back up in there. The only downside is they don't go up very high because it's made for working on an ATV. So what I ended up having to do was take the wheels off this truck and lower it down and get the brakes just off the ground so that I could get it high enough with that to get the transmission back in. So gotta make do. It is what it is. So let's see if we can get this thing lined up the last bit of the way and start getting this torque converter in. Okay, so we're kind of in the home stretch here. Got the transmission all back reinstalled. What I went ahead and did is I dropped the pan so I could change out this filter. And it's a good thing I dropped it to check it, because this transmission actually has no filter in it. Yes, I'm not so sure how I feel about that. Hopefully somebody didn't rob some of these solenoids and put some old war ones out, but we're going to have to go ahead and put a new filter in this thing and kind of hope for the best, I guess.